Okay, class, welcome to General Psychology. I'm Jessica Williams, your teacher, and I'm going to be, every week I'll be doing a PowerPoint lecture based on the chapter that you're reading. Please also continue to read your chapters in whole because the quiz questions won't necessarily be coming from my lecture, and neither will the weekly discussion question. So it's really important that although you're listening to these lectures, you're also continuing to read your textbook on your own. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. What we're starting with today is Chapter 1, The Origins of Psychology. So the study of psychology, this study of psychology investigates a wide variety of questions and attempts to answer them using scientific methods. Psychology helps us evaluate the many so-called psychological facts we encounter every day. An understanding of psychology will help you to think critically and evaluate scientifically based facts. The definition of psychology, we're going to sort of break this down into multiple main points about psychology. This slide talks about how psychology is really the scientific study of the behavior of humans and other animals. It is based on the careful application of scientific methods, and it's not just common sense. It deals with people effectively and is only a small part of the science of behavior. So a really good example of psychology as a science and not just common sense comes from research done in 1970 by Latané and Darley. This research that was done, it actually goes quite against common sense because we would often expect that the more people that are present in an emergency situation, the more likely it is that one of those people will act on it or notice what's happening. The study that Latané and Darley did in 1970 determined that actually the opposite is true. So it turns out from this research that the presence of other people affects our perception of an emergency situation, and we tend to diffuse our responsibility to act in an emergency to others who are present. So what this means is that instead of the more people there means the more active people will be in noticing or deterring an emergency, the opposite is true. People who are on their own are more likely to intervene in an emergency than a group of people. This experiment helps explain bystander apathy. Okay, so the next part of our definition of psychology is going to be discussing the study of behavior. So psychologists are interested in studying both observable behavior and mental processes. Observable behavior being the behavior that you can see happening, mental processes being what's happening in the mind to cause that behavior. Okay, so the third part of our definition of psychology is that psychology encompasses the study of humans and other animals. There are some really good reasons that we'll go over as to why psychologists use the study of other animals as well as humans, and some really important ones. So first of all, one of the biggest reasons is for simplicity's sake. So when you think about a scientist who needs to figure out something about an organism, or maybe like in your high school biology class, I don't know, you might have dissected an earthworm or something like that. So instead of just immediately going to the biology of a very complex mammal like a human, you started out with an earthworm so that you could still see the basic building blocks of an organism, but you started with something that was much simpler than a very complex organism. Same thing is true with psychology. Starting with a simpler brain, it's easier to understand sometimes how the brain is affecting the behaviors when it's a simpler organism, a simpler brain structure. It also provides greater control in the experiment. Humans, if you're doing a multi-day experiment, might be very hard to control every aspect of that experiment, as you can imagine, since we have such pre-thinking ability. With animals, it's much easier to maintain a steady control during your experiment so that you know that your results are really right on. Also, ethical issues are a big one when you're talking about doing research on humans. Obviously, ethical considerations need to be thought of also with animals, absolutely. However, when a drug is first introduced, for instance, through the FDA, that drug has to pass through multiple tests safely with animals before they will have approval to test it on a human being. Now, in psychology, in the field of psychology, before any research can take place, it needs to be submitted, a proposal for the research project is submitted to an institutional review board. And what that means is this institutional review board is responsible for making sure that in this research project, the highest ethical standards are being maintained and that there is no unintentional or unnecessary harm coming to any participants, animal or human. It's also just much more practical to use animals to study behavior in psychology. It's much harder for people to take part in such long-term studies, given that they have jobs and lives. Animals is much simpler, again, going back to that control and just simplicity. Also really important to learn more about animal behavior. And this, in one big reason, is because people are also animals. So if we can learn more about animal behavior, that can help us learn more about human behavior as well. Psychology's history. Psychology has roots in philosophy and also has a fundamental interest in the relationship between the mind and the body. Again, think of that behavior and the mental process that goes along with it. Probably the most important philosopher to know about right now in relation to psychology would be René Descartes, who proposed that the mind and body are distinct entities that interact at the pineal gland. This is known as dualism. So he said that the physical body was mechanical and the mind or soul was not physical. It somehow interacted through the pineal gland to produce intentional behavior. René Descartes said, I here remark, in the first place, that there is a vast difference between mind and body in respect that body, from its nature, is always divisible, and that mind is entirely indivisible. This would be sufficient to teach me that the mind or soul of man is entirely different from the body. So Descartes' ideas have influenced our perception of mind and body, free will, which is central to our assumption that behavior is caused or determined by physical events, and determinism, which is central to the science of psychology. Psychology also has its roots in physiology, and physiologists adhere to the concept of empiricism, meaning that they are well versed in the scientific method. The scientific method includes careful observation of events in the world, the formation of predictions based on these observations, and the testing of these predictions by manipulations of variables and systematic observation. The combination of physiology and philosophy is kind of how contemporary psychology has come to be, because there are still philosophical questions that come up in the field of psychology about the connection of the mind and the body, but its strict adherence to the scientific method really reflects the history of the empirical nature of physiology. Okay, another important thing to know about the history of psychology is structuralism. And structuralism is an approach to psychology that attempts to break down experience into its basic elements or structures. So if you can think of something along the lines of a building, instead of having the experience of the entire building, breaking that building down into each specific part that makes it all together. So the screws, the wood, the foundation, all of those things, breaking it down into parts. That's what structuralism attempted to do with psychology. And it did this through using a technique called introspection, in which subjects provide scientific reports of perceptual experiences. So in introspection, the people participating would attempt in a certain experience to try to break it down into very specific little particles. So each thought, each feeling, all of these things. And Wilhelm Wundt established the first psychology laboratory in 1879 at the University of Leipzig, and he defined the task of psychology as the systematic study of the structure of the conscious mind. So when you think of structuralism, really think of this guy, because this is your main guy. He believed that conscious mental processes could be understood by breaking them down into basic elements. He used introspection in the study of mental processes. So again, just remember, structuralism, think of a structure like a building and think about trying to deconstruct that by taking it apart one element at a time. That's sort of what this belief, this school of psychology went for. So one of Wundt's students, Edward Titchener, established a psychology laboratory at Cornell University in 1892. Structuralism was pretty short-lived and fell out of favor with psychologists, partly because it was found to be impractical. And in this way, it paved the way for functionalism. So part of the problem with structuralism was that people found that when you took an experience and tried to deconstruct it into all of these different tiny particles, you lost the whole experience. Instead of just experiencing the experience, constantly trying to work through that introspection to dissect it and find out what was going on meant that it was hard to experience anything. Secondly, it was not very objective in that everyone who was participating in this and participating in introspection would have different ideas about what components made up one single experience. So as far as thinking of psychology as a science and adhering to that scientific method, this was not an objective way to try to understand what experiences felt like for people and what mental processes were going into those experiences. Okay, so another school of thought in the history of psychology is functionalism. And this is an approach to psychology that emphasizes the functional, practical nature of the mind. So this functionalism was heavily influenced by Darwin's theory of natural selection. Functionalists attempted to learn how mental processes such as learning, thinking, and perceiving helped people adapt. So much like physical evolution occurs when a species continues to need a trait or finds a trait useful, it will hold on to that trait and it will continue throughout generations, versus a trait that's not useful, that will usually, a species will adapt and that will change and drop off. A good example of a trait that's been kept is the protective coloration of some types of moths or the opposable thumbs of humans. Those are both traits that have been useful to that species and so have continued. So William James is really the father of functionalism. So when you think of functionalism, think of William James. And he really felt that the science of psychology would be better served by attempting to understand the fluid, functional, continually changing personal nature of the conscious experience. He wanted to understand the mental processes that helped humans and animals adapt to their environments. So William James really differentiated himself from Wilhelm Wundt and structuralism. He really felt that he would like to instead really focus on the functionality of the conscious mind instead of trying to deconstruct it into every single particle. Just remember, with William James, heavily influenced by Charles Darwin, and he wrote The Principles of Psychology, which was his landmark text. And also just keep in mind with functionalism, it's all about learning how mental processes help people adapt to their environment and their situation. So again, think of Darwin, evolution, adaptation, that's functionalism. So both Structuralism and functionalism have their place in modern psychology. Structuralism brought psychology into the laboratory by demonstrating that mental processes were a legitimate focus for scientific research. And functionalism broadened psychology to include the study of non-human animals, and it expanded the data of psychology to include observations of behavior. Which leads us to our next big one, which is psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud is the father of psychoanalysis, and he named it after the procedure employed in interviewing patients with neurotic symptoms. The talking cure became known as catharsis, and Freud believed that sexual urges were powerful energizers of human behavior, and its emphasis was the unconscious mind. So much of the impact of psychoanalysis lies in the critical reactions it has generated, not on the contributions made to modern psychology. Psychoanalysis assertions cannot be tested in the laboratory, and Freud's impact on psychology was profound. Psychoanalysis is still practiced today. So some things about Sigmund Freud. He was a firm believer in most things having to do with early childhood experiences, and also being very related to sexual urges. This was a pretty racy belief at the time, and it definitely shocked a lot of his colleagues and lay people. He really emphasized the unconscious mind, and in a lot of his work was focused on hypnosis. So he would have people sort of go back to their early childhood. There he would find the cause of all of their troubles, and then they would, talk through these things in these long sessions, and that was known as catharsis. And this is how Sigmund Freud believed that people would be cured from their neuroses. Neurotic is not a diagnosis any longer. And really important to just remember that his impact on psychology has been profound. He provided important insights into understanding the emotional lives of people. So instead of just focusing strictly on the scientific method, all of that, Sigmund Freud was a little bit of a pioneer, very much a pioneer of his time, in that he really focused a lot more on the emotional lives of people and the emotion of the brain. Okay. Another school of psychology to come about was behaviorism. And this is 1913, John Watson initiated a sudden and dramatic approach to psychology, which replaced both structuralism and functionalism. Behaviorism is a scientific approach to the study of behavior that emphasizes the relationship between environmental events and an organism's behavior. So really important to remember with John Watson, he really criticized the structuralists for the lack of scientific method in introspection, also really criticized the functionalists because of their not going far enough in their rebellion against structuralism. So this behaviorism, the task is simply to observe the relationship between environmental events or stimuli and an organism's responses to them. So as you can imagine, this is very easy to stick very closely to science. It's directly observable, and that was what Mr. Watson was going for. So he believed it was impossible to study the mind objectively, and he imposed introspection. His stimulus-response approach was a radical change from the focus on mental processes. The goal of behaviorism is to identify the processes by which stimuli and responses become connected or associated. Essentially, it is how we learn. So the early goal of behaviorism was to discover the rules of association and how combinations of simple associations lead to complex behavior. Behaviorism is characterized by its insistence upon an empirical, objective science of behavior that has no need for theories of mind or personal freedom. So this is very directly just what happened, how you reacted to it, and then how that gets remembered in your brain. There's not a lot of focus on this unconscious stuff, early childhood memories, not stuff like that. This is very direct and very observable, just like its title would suggest, behaviorism. Another important part before we move on to Gestalt psychology, another very important person to think of in behaviorism was Skinner. And Skinner, when you think of Skinner, think of operant conditioning. And this systematically investigated the effects of reinforcement on behavior. So what happens when you reinforce behavior? And as you can imagine, when behavior is reinforced, it continues. So Gestalt psychology, Wolfgang Kohler. So this is an approach to psychology arguing that the whole of an experience is different from the sum of its parts. An active force in current investigations of perceptual processes, learning, and therapy, emphasizing the whole person. So no more dissecting of things and no more focusing on just one part, but looking at the entire person. Started by a group of German psychologists who disagreed with the principles and methods of both structuralism and functionalism. The whole, our perception, is more than the sum of its parts, sensory elements. Okay, so next we're going to talk about humanistic psychology. So humanistic psychology very much rebelled against all of the other forms that we've been talking about. And this is actually a pretty new school of psychology. So although it's not really part of the history of psychology, excuse me, it's very important to learn about. So when we're talking about humanistic psychology, we're talking about Abraham Maslow and also Carl Rogers. So both of these men believe in de-emphasizing the influence of both environmental events and unconscious processes in determining human behavior, because they argue that this doesn't give enough credit to humans' ability to self-actualize and create their own destiny. So this really emphasizes the role of free choice and our ability to make conscious, rational decisions about how we live our lives, sort of regardless of previous events or behaviors. I like this idea of not being controlled by outside stimuli or unconscious forces, but instead really being able to, create your own world and create your own life and have the power within oneself to do that. Humanistic psychology increased awareness of the importance of such things as love, feeling needed, personal fulfillment, and self-esteem. It has, however, been criticized for its reliance on a non-scientific approach to understanding human behavior. As you can imagine, this approach doesn't have a very formal, doesn't stick very formally to the scientific method, and therefore it is a little criticized in that way because it does veer into more of an art form. So contemporary psychology is sort of a mishmash of those schools and some other ones, and that's kind of where we've come to in our study of psychology. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the fields of specialization in psychology. Cognitive psychology is an approach to psychology that focuses on the ways in which organisms process information, investigating processes such as thinking, memory, language, problem solving, and creativity. So cognitive psychology is refocusing our attention on processes, and again, really, just like the name would suggest, cognitive, very focused on thinking, very focused on how to change thinking processes and all of that. Developmental psychology is a field of specialization in psychology concerned with factors that influence development and shape behavior throughout the life cycle, from conception through old age. So this looks at the whole big picture of developmental psychology, again, not just taking one part of a life, but looking throughout all the stages. These specialists typically focus on a particular phase of the growth process, such as adolescence or old age, and examine how a particular ability or trait unfolds during that phase of development. Oops. All right, social psychology is a field of specialization concerned with understanding the impact of social environments and social processes on individuals. So that's looking at, the world that we live in, the society that we live in, and how that impacts individuals. Personality psychology focuses on exploring the uniqueness of the individual, describing the elements that make up human personality, investigating how personality develops and how it influences people's activities. Do our personalities consist of 3 interacting and sometimes conflicting forces, like the id, ego, and superego described by Freud, or are we better characterized as a composite of 16 primary traits, as suggested by Raymond Cattell? We'll read more into that later on in the textbook, but just some interesting stuff coming up. Personality can be very interesting to think about. Okay, experimental psychology. This is really the primary activity is conducting research, as the title would suggest. Biological psychology is a branch of neuroscience, so really focusing heavily on that physiological background. So focusing on the relationship between behavior and physiological events within the brain and the rest of the nervous system. So really looking at the biology of the brain. In clinical psychology, which is an area of specialization involved in the diagnosis and treatment of behavioral problems. So clinical psychology are the psychologists that are seeing clients, working with clients, using different methods and approaches to counseling and treatment. That's clinical psychology. Clinical psychology and psychiatry can sometimes be confused with one another, and because they do perform comparable functions. However, most clinical psychologists obtain a Doctor of Philosophy, which is a PhD, that is likely to consist of 3 to 5 years of university graduate school. That's different than psychiatry. Psychiatrist is a medical doctor. So they go through all of medical school, just like any doctor would, and they specialize in psychiatry. So that's the difference there, a big one difference to remember. Counseling psychology is an area of specialization involved in the diagnosis and treatment of problems of adjustment. Counseling psychologists focus on less serious problems than do clinical psychologists, and they often work in settings such as schools. Educational psychology is a field of specialization concerned with the study and application of learning, just like you would think from the title there, focusing on areas such as improving educational curricula and training teachers. School psychology really is working in elementary or secondary schools and dealing with the evaluation of students' abilities and interests. Also helping to resolve learning and emotional problems in school settings. Industrial and organizational psychology is a field of specialization concerned with using psychological concepts to make the workplace a more satisfying environment for employees and management. So these would be psychologists who come in and make suggestions about how people can work better together, how to increase productivity, all of those types of things. Engineering psychology. This is a field of specialization concerned with creating optimal relationships among people, the machines they operate, and the environments they work in, sometimes called human factors psychology. We have health psychology next, and this is concerned with the interaction between behavioral facts and physical health. And health psychologists are currently active in such diverse areas as assessing the psychological and physical effects of stress, developing programs to help people reduce stress in their lives. So again, just really looking at the connection between physical health and mental health. Positive psychology is aimed at discovering and promoting the positive strengths and attributes that enable individuals to thrive and succeed. So instead of just focusing on issues that people might come to counseling with and struggles, really focusing on the positive aspects of people's lives and what their strengths are. And forensic psychology. This works with the legal, court, and correctional system to develop personality profiles of criminals, make decisions about disposition of convicted offenders, and help law enforcement understand behavioral problems. There are a great deal of crime series TV shows, I'm sure you've seen some, that incorporate some forensic psychology into their show. Artificial intelligence. This is research developing computer models to simulate human cognitive processes and solve problems. Connectionism, the learning theory by Thorndike that proposed learning as the result of forming associations or connections between stimuli and responses. Modern connectionism is focused on discovering the neurobiological mechanisms underlying learned associations. Evolutionary psychology. This is a recent approach to both investigating and explaining human behavior in terms of natural selection. Can be traced to the early writings of Charles Darwin. Evolutionary psychologists argue that traits may be a result of selection pressures. And cultural psychology. Investigations of how cultural and religious traditions and practices shape and contribute to differences in human behavior. A couple different psychological associations for you to be aware of. The American Psychological Association. This is the major professional organization of psychologists in the United States. This is the organization that puts out the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, which is the accepted form of diagnosing mental illness in this country. And also, you will be citing things. If you cite references in your discussion posts and whatnot, you will be citing them using APA format. And then the American Psychological Association, and this is a professional group of academic and research psychologists founded in 1988. All right, so goals of psychology. These include understanding, predicting, and controlling or influences the phenomena that constitute the subject matter. So the idea of applying psychology to control people's behavior is controversial. I like to think that psychology is more to help understand people's behavior and help people lead more productive lives, feel more fulfilled in life. However, I do think that there's sometimes some paranoia about, psychology being used to control people and be used for nefarious reasons like that. So, a theory, this is a good definition to have. A good psychological theory generates predictions or hypotheses, which are assumptions about how people should respond under certain circumstances. A scientific theory is a logical explanation for all of the relevant data or facts scientists have observed regarding certain natural phenomena. These theories must be testable and refutable. So that means they must be able to be tested, and it must be something that other people can question. That's why it's a theory and not a fact. Okay, a hypothesis is a statement that proposes the existence of a relationship between two variables, typically as a tentative explanation for cause and effect. Hypotheses are often designed to be tested by research. So that would be saying, I believe that if I throw this ball in the air, it will fall to the ground, right? And then testing that. That's a hypothesis, and then testing that hypothesis. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe we could have foreseen an event after it occurred. And then here's just a really good, interesting diagram to look at. This is also in your textbook, but this is a good figure about where most psychologists work. And this is from the APA in 2012. So as you can see, great deal of many psychologists work in university, college, and hospital medical. Okay, and that is going to go ahead and conclude our PowerPoint presentation. So again, just please make sure that you read that chapter because some of the questions on the quiz probably weren't covered in my PowerPoint presentation. If you have specific questions regarding any of this material that I went over, please don't hesitate to email me, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And that's it. Thanks, class. Have a great week, and check the discussion question.